You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Yonah Freemark, a senior research associate at the Urban Institute. We chat about the impacts of the pandemic on office work, rethinking federal transportation policy, and make our annual predictions on next year's transportation policies and projects. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note with a cool stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. Still working on some new designs for scarves and some other cool merch, and looking forward to sharing those with you all soon, when they're finished. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with Bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Yonah Freemark, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, Yonah. You know, this is the 10th visit to the show, and we're excited to have you every year to talk about your annual project report. But what's been going on in the meantime? What else have you been up to?
Oh gosh, so much activity from my home office. But you know, I've been actually going into the office. I work at the Urban Institute.
Oh, you're going into the office?
About half the time. Yep. Take the subway. I'm used to the DC Metro at this point. You know, the service is not perfect and the trains are old, but it works.
How is it going to the office? Like, what's it like? How's that going for you?
You know, it's a good experience for me because I like taking the subway. I like the separation between home and work, but it's surprising how few people want to make that journey. And, you know, I actually think that's sort of an interesting indication of where we're going, because people have the option at this point. It's sort of like an open-ended invitation. And it's intriguing to me that so many people don't actually see it as a benefit.
Do you think it's fear or do you think it's convenience?
I think it's got to be convenience. I think, you know, I talked to a lot of my colleagues who aren't necessarily scared of going to work, but it's almost like a critical mass hasn't arrived at the office to justify going into the office for a lot of people. And so they would prefer just staying at home where they can talk via Zoom, where they can get just as much done in their view than they would be able to at the office. But I think that we're actually losing something there. You know, a lot of economists talk about agglomeration effects, and I see it in my own office. There's sort of a lack of agglomeration effects that I want to see that you could get from the person-to-person contact. And so I'm hopeful we sometimes are able to make our way back to having more people in the office.
I've been interested in that. I mean, I've been working at home since 2014. And before that, you know, I do miss those interactions, you know, just sticking your head around the corner and popping into somebody's office and sharing some nugget of information. But you can't get that from Twitter or from chat rooms or anything like that. It's kind of a different thing. But is that the agglomeration you're talking about? Is just like the pop-in?
Absolutely. I feel like there isn't the type of opportunity to just discuss project ideas, to update people on the type of work you want to be doing, that I think would add to our collective experience and help generate more exciting ideas, to bounce off ideas without too much pressure, like reserving a Zoom meeting time. I think it's something that we're really missing out right now. And I also think it's causing people to be less happy in a lot of cases, you know, among people that I'm seeing.
Huh. What's the lack of happiness coming from? Is it just because you're not able to kind of talk to your colleagues, or is it isolation? What do you think it is?
I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much on everyone else's feelings, but you know, I do think that there is a general sense of isolation. Absolutely. People are sort of operating in their individual rooms, not seeing anybody else during much of the day, maybe having meetings via Zoom, but not actually getting to know the people around them. And I think that is a profoundly anti-human thing. I mean, we're a social species. People want to see each other. And I think, you know, we've got to find ways to see each other more.
It's interesting. Yesterday, the mayor of New York said to a bunch of people, get out of your pajamas and come to work. And as somebody who works from home, I was a little bit like, come on, man, I wear track pants. What are you talking about? There's no pajamas here. But, I think that there's two sides to that. There's definitely some sort of convenience to being at home and getting those 2 extra hours that you didn't have before to work or to relax or to do other things. I think generally as a society, we're overworked. And so I think people have kind of taken ownership of those 2 hours, whether that's what they use for showering or whatever else to go to work. But then on the other side, there is those agglomeration economies. There are the things where you can't replicate at home. You can't replicate a beer, a meetup, those types of things. And even going to conferences, I think it wasn't the conference necessarily and the sessions that people were going for. It's the beers and getting to talk candidly with folks and then, glean information and take what they could and then redisperse it. So I think that's interesting. There's been tons of articles about this in the last couple of days, even from basically every publication I've seen. They've all been talking about, how much work from home is going to impact downtowns. And this is actually something I was going to talk about you later, but it's a perfect kind of time to talk about it. And I'm wondering if this affects our thinking overall on transit expansion and projects and those types of things. I mean, because if people aren't going to be making that work trip, we have other trips that people need to make. What is the reconfiguration of, say, a capital program or formula funding or anything along those lines? It seems like this is a pivot. And we can say this as white collar workers ourselves, but there's that other aspect of equity and, the folks that can't do it, the essential workers, everybody else who isn't able to sit at home in front of their computer and work.
Yeah, I actually am of two minds on this. To some degree, I'm not entirely convinced we're moving, full bore towards a work from home economy. I mean, I certainly think that maybe some past mores about how people work maybe have changed. I feel a lot less worried about the way I'm dressing when I go to work now than I maybe would have a year and a half ago. And I think that's a really good and positive change. I think, we don't need to maintain strict office, dress codes that we used to have. And at the same time there is this interest among people to return to work, despite the skepticism among some. And when I take the subway every day, I mean, part of the problem is DC isn't running enough trains right now, but the trains are pretty crowded. And so it's not that people aren't taking the transit systems that exist, but maybe they're taking them to a somewhat less degree. At the same time, I completely agree with you that there's an opportunity here that I'm not sure transit systems, especially in the US, know how to take advantage of right now, which is, what is the opportunity to try to grab some of those non-work trips and make them part of the commute? I think systems like BART and WMATA in DC were built entirely around work trips, right? They focus on downtowns. They are really designed to make sure you can get from the suburbs to the downtown offices as quick as possible. And they make getting between neighborhoods much more difficult than that. I think, what if we re-envision the way our projects are planned so that we're focusing more on trying to grab those non-work trips that right now are much more likely to be done by car and try to pull some of those into transit? I think it could be transformative in thinking about the types of transit that we're building. But the projects that are going forward right now are still in sort of, I think, the older mode of thinking.
And what types of projects are those? I'm thinking of these huge capital projects in places like New York City or even the BART subway underneath San Jose. But what kind of projects are you thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, those projects are great examples of that. Some of the projects that are opening this coming year are great examples of really downtown-oriented projects. So if you're looking at the new subway projects that are opening in Los Angeles and San Francisco this year, the Green Line extension in Boston, those are three of the biggest projects that are opening this year. And they're actually all really about that sort of outer neighborhood to downtown commute, making sure they're as effective as possible in certain ways. I'm not saying they're bad projects. In fact, I think they're great projects. But I am worried that we don't necessarily know how to connect neighborhoods in more effective ways to get people between the different areas, between the spokes of our transit lines in ways that are not happening right now. Just to give you an example of this, the Green Line project in Boston is going out into Somerville and Medford, sort of suburban communities outside of Boston. And it's going to actually dramatically improve their ability to get into downtown. And that's wonderful. But getting from Somerville and Medford into Cambridge and into the southern parts of Boston is very difficult right now and is not really going to be improved by this project. So what's the plan to actually address those types of travel that may have nothing to do with work at all, but may have more to do with entertainment retail, restaurants, going to school. I think we need to be thinking more about how we make those sort of circumferential connections to be more effective.
One of the things I've been noodling on lately, and I'm just going to share this unrefined to you, is, we have this big transit capital program and New Starts. And then we've talked about this for, almost a couple decades now. We've been doing this for such a long time with each other. But, we have this huge capital program, and it builds projects one by one. And what happens is, in a lot of cities outside of New York, in the Big Five, Chicago, Philadelphia, DC, San Francisco, et cetera, it builds these projects one by one. And in a place like Minneapolis or even in Charlotte, you get these one projects. And then what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on the real estate in that corridor. It sucks a lot of the life out of like regional development. And what it also does is kind of focus, a lot of the capital expenditure, on that individual line from a regional perspective. And that causes displacement, gentrification, all those other things. And in my brain, what about rethinking our networks? And this isn't just a plain bus network redesign. I'm just thinking about regional planning and how we do things overall. We have these system plans where we build one line at a time. What if we rethought that and then allowed people to apply for New Starts funding to build regional networks instead of just one line at a time? And I'm not talking about light rail networks necessarily or subway networks or anything like that. Maybe it's just capital improvements for bus rapid transit or capital improvements for these connectors, right? It seems like there's a big disconnect between what the capital funding should be for and what it's actually being used for.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really cool idea. I think it's also worth thinking about that idea within the context of some of the transit network redesigns that people like Jarrett Walker have been piloting. He's basically saying we need to go around the country, look at the existing bus networks and reallocate service so that we're prioritizing corridors that are going to have frequent bus routes, so that you can have a grid of connectivity across the city. And I think that's wonderful. But what if you cannot combine that sort of network redesign with very clear thinking about which specific routes there need to get that sort of high quality New Starts level service? So in other words, not only are you changing the way the bus network works, but you're combining it with long-term thinking about what a network of regionally planned either bus rapid transit, light rail, or subways could look like. And I think that has not been the way people at the Federal Transit Administration are thinking. And it's not really the way people, I think, in these regional transit agencies are thinking either.
I think it's what LRTPs are actually for and what MPOs are actually supposed to do. But it seems like it migrated from that at some point to individual projects. And I don't know why that happened, or, I guess maybe there never was really a network thinking outside of WMATA to a certain extent, I guess, the Great Society subway. But everywhere else just seemed line by line, and it's frustrating and interesting at the same time. But it's something to think about. The other thing I want to talk to you about was kind of a funny thing that happened this last year. There was a viral meme that went around about housing specifically, and you were included in the cartoon. I'm sure you saw this. How did you feel about that?
In my job at the Urban Institute, I'm the research director of something called the Land Use Lab at Urban. And we are trying to conduct new research on the impacts of land use on a variety of different things. So, I specifically land use regulations on a variety of different outcomes in terms of society, in terms of housing costs, in terms of access to transportation. And I think there's a tendency in the Twitterverse to turn what in fact are complicated, non-binary issues into single-minded debates where there is a clear answer to a question. And, what's funny about that video, for those of you who have seen it, is that I believe that I am portrayed as somebody who is sort of not wanting to partake in this conversation, and yet I'm in it. And I think that's because some of the research I've done on upzoning. And I actually appreciated the video because I do think it sort of reflects on, to some degree, my hesitation to, be too strong about what we know about how land use regulations are going to change the world. I think we should be careful to make any extreme claims about the impact of any one policy, especially land use policy, on outcomes. I don't want people out there to think that, this means that we shouldn't try to change our policies to encourage more development. We absolutely need more housing out there. We absolutely need to give people access to transportation. We absolutely need more affordable housing, especially. But the idea that any individual policy is going to solve the problems, and therefore any debate about that is just a massive confrontation of complete disagreement, I think is simplifying.
Did you find it funny, at least a little bit?
Oh, absolutely.
Entertaining?
I find it funny only insofar as I have managed not to pull myself too far into it. I feel like the great thing about being somebody who has written about transportation issues for the last at least 14 years is that I think housing issues, especially in the United States, the debate is virulent and unhappy. But the conversation about transit, I think, can often be a really positive, exciting space where people have exciting views about the future and want to see change in a positive way and don't turn it into a space of hatred. And I just like that. And I'm able to pull myself away from the housing conversation and think about transportation. And I think that's a really positive thing for me from a mental health perspective.
No, that is really good. And I do appreciate being in transportation space, even though we do talk about housing, because it is interconnected. Everything's connected. But I just found that entertaining that I was watching this cartoon, this anime cartoon, and with, subtitles and people associated. And I saw your name pop up and I was like, well, why is Yonah in here? I was like, oh, it must be that study he did in Chicago. And it's kind of entertaining. But the NIMBY YIMBY battles get pretty, like you said, virulent. And it is a little bit distressing sometimes that they get so heated. And it makes for an interesting conversation about why, those discussions on housing get so heated, whereas discussions on transportation may not get like that. Maybe it's just because there's not really an entrenched interest necessarily, I guess, in transportation, and people's, assets aren't necessarily up for grabs when you talk about transportation. So it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. I mean, the reason why housing makes people so upset is because it feels so personal. And I understand that. I pay too much. Other people pay too much to buy a house. And it's incredibly frustrating to feel like our society is structured in such a way to make housing such an extreme expense. And transportation, frankly, offers people a way out, right? If you feel like the transit system isn't good enough, which unfortunately it often isn't, you can go buy a car and you're going to have your own struggles, but you have a way out. But the housing market doesn't really give people a way out, especially when you live in a really expensive city. And I think that makes people really angry when they feel like they're not seeing action on those issues. And so, I understand it.
Yeah. Well, let's pivot a little bit to federal transportation policy. You also released a report with Harriet Tregoning, Next Generation Place-Based Federal Transportation Policy. What's that report discuss, and why was it so important to put it together?
I think we have a problem in the United States of not being able to move past the approach we've taken to transportation policy, frankly, since the passage of the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. We just passed this really big infrastructure law, which had some positive elements, unquestionably. It increased funding for Amtrak. It includes a lot of money for energy upgrades for sustainability and for lead pipe removal. Wonderful. But it also includes a significant number of dollars that are going to be distributed to states who are then going to spend the money on expanding highways, building new highways. And we've already seen a number of states actually write letters to the Department of Transportation telling them they essentially don't want the hands of the US federal government on their highway money. They want to be able to build as many highways as they want. I think that Harriet and I were inspired by the sense of the lack of a transformative nature in the policy to suggest that we just need to sort of throw it out. We need to throw out this approach to thinking about transportation as this siloed thing where we just fund the status quo. We need to think about transportation with a new perspective that's focused on achieving equity and sustainability at the core, and then going out from there. What are we doing in our decision-making related to transportation that's going to achieve those outcomes? And what we suggest actually is that, number one, we need to be evaluating all our transportation projects against those attributes. Is your project going to increase equity and resolve climate change issues, or is it going to make those worse? If it's going to do the latter, then why are we funding it, first of all? Second of all, how are we making sure that projects actually are being produced in a creative way by communities that want to do something different, that integrates transportation into broader thinking about housing, healthcare, parks, etc.? And I think we're sort of focusing on the idea that it's possible to rethink our transportation investments, not just around the infrastructure itself, but rather around how we can use that infrastructure as a lever to then generate communities that integrate all those things together: affordable housing, access to healthcare, access to jobs, and access to recreation. So that's what we're trying to go for in this sort of position paper. I hope it's inspiring to at least some people.
Why not everybody?
Why not everybody?
I think that's a good set of goals. I think that that's a good way to go. It is frustrating to see kind of what happened, especially with the infrastructure bill. Yes, there are some good things about it, lead pipes included, et cetera. But there's also a lot of frustration just because of how it came about. We'll get to that probably in the predictions in a second, I'm sure. But it's been kind of up and down, I think, for the last year or so, watching kind of that sausage making happen. And it's been frustrating also to not see anything change from a kind of a distribution standpoint. And even when Stephanie Pollock sends a letter to everybody that says, hey, we'd like you to, focus on fix it first, everybody starts yelling. And it's like, this letter is not a requirement. It's just a gentle nudge to say, and then everybody freaks out. And you even have senators freaking out about it. It's like, you guys really are, proving a point here that you're just, going with the status quo and not actually trying to think of anything different when all you do is push back on nudges to do the right thing. So that was a frustrating thing as well. All right. So we have you on every year to talk about your annual post on openings and construction starts, which you can find obviously at thetransportpolitic.com. For those who might not be listening every single year for the last so many years and the last 10 episodes that we've done together, what's the purpose of the post and the accompanying Transit Explorer database?
Well, obnoxiously, I would say the purpose of the post is to document the delays in the Honolulu rail transit project. Because I'm pretty sure that it's been on every single post I've done since 2009, and it still has not opened. Maybe this year. I think more positive. The goal of this work is really to be able to say, what are all the scopes of transit projects opening all over? Well, it used to be the United States, but now it's a number of countries around the world. And the idea is basically to give people a sense of optimism, I think, about, okay, we're actually investing in some really positive changes in our transportation system, to give people a sense of what's coming in their communities in the coming year based on planning, and to give people a chance to think about what might be missing there. And so, we developed this Transit Explorer interactive map to really document where all the projects that are existing, under construction, or planned are, and then give people ideas, what might be missing on that map? Where are there projects that people might want to see that for some reason planners in their communities are not looking for yet?
There's some positive stuff, I think. It's just not just about Honolulu, obviously. And I went back and listened to last year's show, and I noticed that the Honolulu example was used as one of the predictions that failed. And I don't think you made the prediction again, but I think it's been on a couple of shows, as you mentioned. But we did have San Diego and Seattle's Northgate extension this year. We had some good stuff happening. So those are positive outcomes, I imagine, that you rejoice in.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, I think it was kind of shocking to me that any project opened in 2021, only insofar as transit agencies faced a lot of struggles and could probably continue to face a lot of struggles. And I was able to document some of those. We did a report with APTA, the American Public Transportation Association. We interviewed transit agency officials in 5 cities. And frankly, they have dealt with rapidly increasing inflation, which has made it really difficult to hold on to bus and train drivers. They've dealt with material shortages, which has made it really difficult to keep construction going. They've dealt with, in some cases, inability to get permits and other types of authorizations from state governments that have slowed down. And when you put these things together, frankly, it's surprising that they've been able to keep services going. And so I think, it's easy to criticize transit agencies that aren't necessarily performing up to our high expectations, but at the same time, they've done a lot of impressive things to keep these public services going. And I really commend them for that. And the fact that they were able to open these new lines in, San Diego and Seattle is really exciting to see.
You're doing the report this year, going through, obviously it's all not at once because you build up the database over time, because doing it at once would be crazy, crazy for you. What's something that's been exciting about putting it together? What are some projects that you're seeing that you're very interested in seeing move forward?
Well, I think one of the aspects of the investments that I've seen change over time has been an improvement in the quality of the bus rapid transit lines that are being advanced by cities. I think, when we were talking 10 years ago, I think when the first Tiger grants were going out from the Obama administration, some of those grants were going to streetcar and supposed bus rapid transit projects.
Rapid
And,
bus.
you know, frankly, a lot of those projects were some improved shelters and buses getting stuck in traffic coming once every 15 minutes at best. And that was considered an improvement in the bus service in a lot of cities. And I think we didn't necessarily have the judgment at the time to be able to say, guys, what are we doing here? Or at least we didn't have the expectation of US transit agencies be able to do something different. But more recently, we've seen a lot of projects that are really actually strong investments for bus rapid transit. You know, the Columbus Avenue Busway in Boston, the Van Ness BRT in San Francisco that's about to open are really high quality bus infrastructure. The sort of very clear dedicated lanes for the buses, very nice stations, clear transit signal priority. And when you put those things together, you're going to get a much higher quality service than you got with old investments in bus improvements. And so I'm really feeling good about that because I think there's a lot more willingness on the part of local stakeholders to actually make that change. I can see that in the place where I live in Washington, D.C., where, you know, they just released a bus plan where they're actually committing to really dedicating lanes to buses. And obviously, there's going to have to be some pressure to keep up with that and make sure they actually achieve that. But that dedication to busways and the fact that they're building them right now on 16th Street is a change. We would not have seen that 15 years ago. And in fact, we didn't. So I'm excited about that.
You alluded to this, but is it really just because there were no examples out there and now there are? Or is it just because transit agencies learned a lesson by looking at the schedules and what was actually happening on these rapid bus routes?
Well, I think it's a mix of things. I think there were a lot of people 10 years ago who were supporting, for example, trips to South and Central America to look at bus rapid transit systems in Curitiba and other cities. And in retrospect, I think that some of those trips perhaps misunderstood what would be appealing to local stakeholders. The idea that you could take something in a very large developing country highway and translate it onto the streets of a US city, I think was misinformed and unrealistic. I think that we were giving people this impression of what bus rapid transit could be. Politicians, even those who were interested, took it home and said, we would never put a Curitiba style busway on our street. We don't even have a highway in the middle of our city that we can stick it on. That's not a possibility. So as a result, they said, yeah, we'll improve bus service. And that meant making the bus shelter slightly better. I think that the continuous pressure from advocates to improve bus service, as well as the acknowledgement that actually bus lanes do make a difference, has been what the change has happened. And I think, New York's rollout of its select bus service has not been perfect, but it has demonstrated the ways in which you can do this on a sort of citywide basis. You can select corridors, get positive results, and see outcomes that people want to see. So I think that has actually been more effective as a model than maybe the South American ones were.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, shall we get to some predictions from last year? All right. Well, I want to go back to 2 years ago.
Oh.
And the reason why is because we talked about it last year, but I want to kind of bring it back again. So one of the things you mentioned came up again recently, which is Tri-Rail to Miami. We talked about this on the Monday show a few weeks ago, but basically, I'm not sure when it'll open, but the downtown station won't fit Tri-Rail trains. So I'm wondering if you saw this. You predicted that this would happen 2 years ago, and it didn't happen. It was one of our negatives last year, but I also saw that news recently, and I thought that was kind of hilarious that it popped up again here.
So frustrating. I did see that, and I believe it has something to do with the size of the trains, right? They can't fit on the platforms.
It's the step downs. It's the steps, and the steps are going to rip into the platform itself, I think. So they'd have to rejigger those or do something along those lines. It's like, did you not think about this?
Doesn't this remind you? I seem to remember this story of when the Acela was first introduced in 1999. I believe that the trains, which were designed for doing obviously fast service throughout the route, unfortunately tilted so much when they were accelerating that if they were to go at their higher speeds on some of the parts of the corridor, they would run into the other trains on the other tracks.
Oh.
And I believe this actually caused a number of slowdowns compared to what they initially expected with those trains. And this is the kind of thing where you ask, what is going wrong with the procurement and engineering processes that result in this kind of mistake? I mean, should not be happening. And I can only hope that Tri-Rail is not paying for the use of platforms it can't use.
Yeah. I hope there's a solution of some sort, but it's going to be some sort of an engineering solution where they have to either chop up the steps or they're going to chop up the platforms. And I don't think either one is beneficial, but I guess they'll have to figure it out. You also doubled down on a prediction that the Honolulu rail line would open in 2021. I don't believe that's the case, but that was there.
Should I triple down and say it's going to open in 2020?
Why not? I mean, yeah, let's do it.
If it doesn't open in 2022, I swear to God. Listen, I think that I think that the Honolulu rail project first phase was originally supposed to open in 2012, if I remember correctly. If that is the case, this project first phase will be 10 years late. So if they can't do it 10 years late, then, I'm giving up.
The whole project was supposed to be done in 2020, I think is what you said.
That's right.
Before. So yeah, we'll double down on that and hopefully it'll open this year, at least the section between the stadium and the outskirts.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so you said, I think we might see an election coming up in Charlotte, and the reason is they want to build a new east-west line that would serve the airport in the west. In the next 2 years in Charlotte, we will have an election, and I said I'd take that bet myself. So it's interesting because news lately has been saying and showing up that they're arguing over this, whether they're going to have an election or not. I don't know if you've seen any of those news items, but it seems like locally they're struggling over whether they're going to have an election or not. At the moment, I'm leaning towards no from the standpoint of just where transit is at the moment from a ridership and kind of resources perspective. I'm thinking that they're going to wait a little while, but that could change, I guess. But that's kind of where I'm at.
One thing I find interesting about cities like Charlotte is that I'm not sure that their local leaders are aware of the fact that if they do not find local sources of funding to promote their projects, they're going to really get behind on the federal queue. I think we're about to see a bunch of projects funded in Austin. We're going to see more projects funded in Raleigh, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, all these cities that have passed transit referenda and that have the local funding to match the federal dollars. And if other cities like Charlotte are not able to find new funds to support their match, then they're going to have a really hard time getting that federal funding coming anytime soon. So, I agree with you. I'm not seeing a rush in Charlotte to passing a new referendum to get that new transit line up and going. And I agree with you that the climate for transit in Charlotte is not necessarily positive. But if they want to see a transit for their future, the more they delay on their local funding, the more they're going to be delaying on getting these projects done.
I think that's true. Another interesting thing, I talked with Ian at Seamless Bay Area last week, and he was mentioning that even the Bay Area, we might go have an election in 2024 for a massive, Seattle, LA style referendum where we can build a big amount of projects. And I think that when you have those in the large cities and they're large projects, I think you kind of suck a lot of the air out of the room as well. So that's something to think about for some of these smaller places. And maybe, going back to our previous discussion about thinking about network design and, what you can do with capital money, that might be a better alternative for a place like Charlotte than it is for a larger city.
I mean, I think that is worth considering. And I think you're right that more than just, the cities that already have funding sources, we're going to see a lot of big cities getting new funds for transit coming very soon. I think you're right. San Francisco is going to probably put something on the ballot, and I would expect pass funding for a new Transbay tunnel, which is going to eat up a ton of money. New York is going to ask for money for Second Avenue subway and maybe for Triborough or the Interborough Express project. These are huge projects that, are going to take up a lot of that federal dollar. What's going to be left for the cities that haven't thought about how they're going to fund their projects yet?
Not much. It makes me wonder if there should be kind of like they've done for the Gateway project, maybe there's a separate pot for these large mega projects that can be pulled out because it seems like they're just going to eat up everything. So we'll see how that goes. So your next one is Gwinnett County will also have another election in 2022.
I don't think it's too late. It's still possible.
You can still put it on the ballot. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, It was so close in
It was so
2020.
close.
It was like I think it was like a few thousand votes.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that the possibility is there. But yeah, I don't know. It might require
It was a
some
few
more.
thousand votes, but it was a very, very good election
Uh-huh.
for Georgia Atlanta in that way that I hope we see that kind of,
For people who might be voting for transit.
right. I hope
Yes.
we see that kind of energy again, but I don't know if you will. So coming that short, it reminds me of Austin in 2000. They lost with, less than 2,000 votes when George Bush was on the ballot. So interesting kind of comparison there.
So based on that, they're gonna have to wait until 2040 in Gwinnett.
I hope not. I do not wish Austin on anybody, that type of 20-year waiting period. But, who knows what's going to happen. It's interesting to think of 2000 as, light rail in San Diego was 1981, right? That was the first kind of major light rail project. And then 20 years later, you see a vote in Austin. And then 20 years later, Austin actually gets it. So 40 years from the first light rail in the United States, you get light rail in Austin, Texas. And it's split by that vote in the very middle.
Wow. I mean, progress is slow.
Yeah. Okay. So number 2 question last time was, and then we kind of flittered with the first question, but the number 2 question was, because of the pandemic, we were like, well, predictions, maybe there won't be a ton of predictions to be made, but maybe we can talk about this infrastructure bill that they're talking about at the time. So here's your quote. I think that my prediction is there's going to be an infrastructure bill this year. That's sort of my general prediction. And I don't think it's going to be a significant expansion over the current transportation authorization, which is set to expire, I believe, in October. So my prediction is that it will increase transit funding quite spectacularly, for Amtrak funding by even more. That's not bad.
Hey, that was pretty on point.
Yeah.
I think that is accurate. Status quo policy, big increase for Amtrak and somewhat increase for transit. That is 100% correct. I guess I didn't think it was going to be combined with an energy and water bill, but there you go.
Well, infrastructure, right? It's more than just roads and pipes. So there's other pieces here that are interesting. I think that the way that they're going to do it is by repealing some of the Trump tax cuts.
Huh.
I don't think that's correct.
That is not. They did it by essentially using debt.
Yeah, by more debt, which is, yeah. And then the next one is really interesting. I still think it only be passed if it's passed by 51 votes with 50 Democrats and the vice president.
That was wrong.
That was also interesting.
That was totally wrong. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is surprising that, well, interestingly, it was bipartisan in the Senate, but very few House Republicans, I believe, voted for it. And that is interesting.
There were more. They got a little cover. I think maybe like 10 to 15 of
10
them.
to 15.
Maybe something like that. Is that right?
Sounds right.
Sounds about right. But yeah, I think there was cover that more of them voted for that because they saw that the Senate did, and I'm sure they got yelled at by whoever, but whatever. And you made a fantastical prediction as well, which was that Amtrak will spend $1 trillion on high-speed rail.
Okay, that hasn't happened.
No,
Amtrak has not proposed a single high-speed rail project.
Yeah. So you got this right, and I'm very impressed.
It's a positive spin.
Yeah, no, I mean, how to pay for it is kind of a thing, and how it's going to get passed is kind of a thing. But the general gist of it, you got right. So I continue to be impressed with your predictions, Yonah.
Well, it was, I think the Amtrak Joe thing, it came true. Amtrak is Joe Biden's favorite public service, and they're benefiting from that.
For sure. So on my end, though, I got a lot very wrong.
Oh no!
So this will be entertaining, I'm sure. So I thought we'd get rid of the 80-20 split. Wrong. I thought a major focus of the bill will be fix it first. Wrong. Spending money on electrifying fleets. Mail delivery is not going to be electric anytime soon. So that's 3 strikes. It's kind of rough on me. We did get a bunch of money for chargers, but that's not necessarily what I meant.
Better than nothing, I guess.
I guess so.
Yeah, I think you should give yourself some credit.
Like a half a point out of 10,
half a point,
maybe.
Yeah.
And then my fantastical argument, which is so really wrong, was that we're going to stop talking about the gas tax and to fund everything with a carbon tax.
Oh, carbon tax. Wow.
That was my fantastical prediction. We both got one fantastical prediction. Yours was $1 trillion for high-speed rail. Mine was the carbon tax. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the final. We'll wait to give our predictions for next year, but I want to hear some of your thoughts on the infrastructure bill. You talked about it a little bit earlier, but kind of your kind of big picture thinking, especially since we got the infrastructure bill, but not kind of the conjoined BBB with it.
Yeah, I think from a transportation policy perspective, the law as passed has been just a disappointment because you only get so many possibilities to make a major change in how federal transportation works. And we just lost one in terms of looking for major change. And, nobody's really going to touch this for at least the next 5 years. And who knows what the world's going to be like in 5 years. I do think that one thing that is clear about the confluence of power in the US federal government right now is that, especially on environmental policy, I think there has been I don't know if it's an intentional decision or if it's just the reality of who's in power. It's resulted in a acknowledgement that the only way we're going to really see progress, at least at the national level, is through private sector intervention on decarbonization. I think that there's some positive moves in the infrastructure bill towards funding projects that would reduce carbon emissions, but frankly, the federal government is not going to be the leader on pushing for less carbon emissions from the transportation sector. It just isn't. I think we're seeing more progress from state governments like Colorado in pushing for assessments of the climate change impacts of new infrastructure projects. We're also seeing more states having open conversations about the devastating impacts of highways on their communities. We're hearing that in both New York and California. And I think that dialogue is new and really positive. And we're also seeing open pushback, whether from community groups or from individual politicians, from the idea that we have to expand highways in every case. I think the situation in the Rose Quarter in Portland, Oregon, the pushback in the Houston area around highway expansion are indicative of a changing mentality at the local and state levels, at least in terms of advocate involvement. And so I am hopeful that those will have to be sort of at the forefront. We can't think of the federal infrastructure law as the thing that's going to get us there. We're going to have to rely on private sector intervention towards electrification and state and local activism promoting change.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Houston, because I think that is the reason why they can push back is because there's somebody, a partner at the federal level, that is allowing them to make the case. So in one way, if they didn't have the local push, then it's unlikely that, Secretary Buttigieg would, or whoever is in charge of, those types of regulations and rules, would push back on the freeway and make them pause it and redo their environmental impact statement and those types of things. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, earlier this week, we saw where a judge in Louisiana took away the ability to socially cost carbon. And so, there's a lot of permits for oil and gas drilling. And I imagine that, a lot of the infrastructure that would, use the social cost of carbon, which, it ranges anywhere from $50 to $100 a ton, would be used in any meaningful way. So that, the federal action is something that was used to justify a lot of these climate actions, but they're getting whittled away by judicial action. And I think we'll see that in the Supreme Court soon as well with the EPA, whether they have the ability to regulate environmental stuff like, air quality and things like that because of the way that the federal society and those assholes think. So that's my opinion, not yours. I won't judge that for you. But I as an independent person, I'm just going to say that. And so, I think that's going to be really frustrating for a lot of environmental activists. And I think it's going to be frustrating for a lot of folks who are working on climate action and seeing a lot of these big projects continue to kind of rumble down the road and not be able to do much about it because of judicial action. So it's something that we definitely will watch out for. You can't really, except for appointing judges, there's not really much you can do about it given the more rural bent of, federal, elections and those types of things. So it might have to be like cities, and it might have to be private action, and it might have to be really strong local pushback. And the crazy thing about Portland, for example, and the Rose Quarter is that the governor is a Democrat and the Transportation Commission should know better. And they even, they talk about out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to climate change and carbon emissions. But then, road building is seemingly exempt to a lot of them. So That's a frustrating thing too.
Well, and I do think there's been a lack of at least open awareness from especially state level officials about this connection. I think you're right. A lot of people talk about how we supposedly care about climate change and then go ahead and push highway expansions. And I think there's sort of an acceptance of whatever the State Department of Transportation tells them that they're supposed to do with regards to investments. And that just sort of reigns in terms of the choices they make. And I'm hopeful that the openness of this dialogue, the debate, sometimes protests over these projects is going to change that and convince people that we need to be thinking about these projects differently.
It's interesting you mentioned state DOTs. I'm wondering, which way do you think it goes? Do you think the power goes from the state DOTs saying that we need to build roads, this is the way it's been, and this is what we're doing, and the politicians follow? Or do you think the political climate is such that we are getting pushback from our constituents that we need to build more roads, and so that's pushing on the state DOTs that are now a little bit more intelligent and know better and are just not doing what they should?
This is a great question. This is an enduring mystery to me. And my general point of view is that the state DOTs are more to blame than individuals asking for improvements. And the reason why I think this is that when you talk to quote normal people who don't think about transportation on a daily basis,
non-transportation,
they don't know what it means to make a project, to think about, okay, what would it be to develop a new highway? Where would it go? Who would it serve? And so they're not calling up their governor and saying, I want a highway that does X or Y thing to solve my congestion problems. The people who are coming up with those ideas are coming from the state DOTs. The reason why governors and states are able to actually respond to citizens by saying, we're solving your congestion problems by building X and Y road is because the state DOTs have developed plans for that road. And I'm convinced that if the state DOTs weren't developing plans for the road, you wouldn't exactly see this like crowd of citizens out there saying, we want to build this specific highway. So I don't know. I think I'm more convinced that we need to attribute blame to state DOTs. We need to hold them accountable and get more out of them.
That's interesting because, I've heard lately from folks at state DOTs that are like, it's the politicians that are saying that this is the thing that needs to happen. It's the politicians that are pushing these projects. And these are more progressive state DOTs, obviously. We're not talking about Nebraska. But it's interesting to think about what side it actually comes from and where the political power comes from, right? Where the power to actually build these projects come from. It was a couple of state DOTs that were pushing back on Stephanie's nudge towards fix it first, but it was also a lot of governors, right?
Yes.
It was a lot of governors saying like, hey, you can't tell us what to do with our money. Whereas, a lot of those places, I'm sure that there's plenty to fix. I don't think nudging people to do fix it first is not telling them, or you have to build a bus rapid transit line in rural area. It's more like, I'm sure you have a bridge or two that's close to being past its useful life. We need to focus on those first.
Yeah, maybe one way to think about it is this. In our days, we've seen.
Oh man, now you're making me feel old.
How many dozens of transit projects that are sort of put out there for study and then are sort of either killed or just sort of die on the vine when somebody makes the decision that, quote, this is infeasible or we don't have enough money for this, so we're just not going to do it. Right? Yeah. That's happened to so many projects that you can think of out there. That is a choice made by departments of transportation. They don't have to be making the choice to deny transit projects the ability to move forward and vice versa. Why don't we hear state DOTs saying, it's just technically infeasible. We don't have the financial capacity to build this new highway project to the governor. That's what they should be saying. They should be telling the governor, we can't do it because it's going to force 1,000 people to have to leave their homes. It's going to degrade the environment and it's a terrible disaster. That's what we should be hearing from the state DOTs telling their governors, but we're not.
Yeah. And I think as schools and education changes too, and there's a fight over the METCD versus NACTO guides and whatever else, I think you'll start to see a shift maybe as people kind of move into those positions of power that can make that comment to the governor or whoever else. So I'm hopeful. I just think it's interesting to think about where that actually is right now in this moment. Okay, predictions for next year. Do you have any? You want me to start?
Sure,
I can start. So at the moment, I'm not sure really what's going to happen, and I don't know if there's going to be section. BBB's dead, right? It's Manchin killed it, Sinema killed it, but I think there will be parts of it that kind of slip forward in some form or fashion in the next 6 months or so before the next election. But I don't think that, DeFazio's transit service access program that he kind of slipped in there is going to actually be there. So that's one of my predictions, is just kind of like, we're going to sit in this kind of la land of thinking about the Build Back Better pieces, but we probably won't get another a crack at the transportation part of that was part of that bill.
I agree with you. I think that we do not have the constituency to reopen transportation as an issue at the federal level. I think Manchin clearly is not interested in passing an ambitious bill. I think that there are some other elements of BBB that have more potential that were not included in infrastructure law, like housing. Hopefully, we'll maybe see some more positive action at the federal level, maybe some more work related to the environment. But transportation, I don't know. I'm skeptical of federal change on that front.
Yeah, I think they shot their shot and decided that was enough. Certain people, obviously, not everybody, but certain people that can decide at the moment because of our system. I do have a silly prediction that you might laugh at, but I do think that the Central Subway and Van Ness will open this year.
I recently saw some pictures of construction on the Central Subway, and I gotta say, it did not look ready, but maybe I'm missing something.
I think they said that it was going to be 23, and so I'm just being optimistic. But maybe they'll get it ready a little early. Maybe they'll throw it out. Maybe a Van Ness and Central Subway. Maybe it'll be a dual party. Get some confetti.
I think that sounds. Don't they run? I mean, they run into each other, right? Am I making this up?
No, they don't. They're parallel. Yeah.
Oh, they're kind of parallel. Okay.
They're parallel. Yeah.
Oh, too bad.
Which is another thing that is weird because it should have been a Geary Subway, but that's another argument for another day. Yeah, so that's my prediction for that. And then also, I think I predicted earlier that Charlotte won't have an election for transit expansion. So those are my three that I put together.
Okay. All right. My predictions are, number one, I think that other cities are going to imitate Michelle Wu's piloting of free transit service. So, as you probably know, Michelle Wu has been a big proponent of free transit and managed to sort of finagle the MBTA into providing free transit on 3 bus routes, including on the Columbus Avenue busway, I think. And I think that other cities are going to be inspired by that. There's a lot of debate out there about whether free transit is a good idea or a bad idea, but there are a lot of examples where free transit does seem to be effective. If you look at the example of Richmond, Virginia, the free transit fare has been pretty strongly associated with pretty strong ridership in that community. And I think free transit has a lot of potential in a lot of smaller mid-sized cities. So I bet you we're going to see 5 other cities piloting free transit.
5 other cities. Okay. Well, it's interesting, Utah is actually doing that free transit month of February because of air quality issues that they always have because of the inversion effects during the winter. And it's just a kind of an air quality hellhole because of the pressures keeping all the pollution inside of the valley. They've gotten 20% increase in ridership just in the first parts of doing that free transit pilot. So I agree with you. I think you'll see a lot more. It's interesting to hear the arguments. I mean, I've gone on the record on the show being like, I'm not quite sure about it. Mostly in major cities. I think smaller cities, you're right. I think it's probably a good deal. But in major cities, you're just cutting so much of the budget out that could be used for better service. So, if you're cutting $200 to $500 million out to make it free, what does that mean for?
How are you going to make it up?
This is it's also a priority thing. Like, would you rather spend that $200-300 million on freeways, or would you just kind of pull that over and keep your budget the same? Like, that's kind of the fight that you need to have. But as we had the discussion about state DOTs earlier, I don't know if you'll actually see that transfer over. So that's the thing I'm worried about is that. But there is something to be said about it. And Michelle just hired Tiffany Chu, who is at Remix. So that's a positive move as her chief of staff, and she'll be focused on that too. And I know that she obviously knows all about the ins and outs of transportation policy related to that. So I think that she's built a good team, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also interested in seeing sort of variations on this theme. Just recently, a council member in Washington, D.C. proposed giving every district resident a $100 sort of voucher to be used on their transit pass every month. So everyone would get $100 every month to use WMATA's Metro Rail and Metrobus system. And it's not exactly the same as free transit because you're not getting the fare exactly paid for, but you are getting this large amount of money to cover fares. And I think this is a potential other way of thinking about free transit fares. Maybe it should come by just giving people money that they can then use on transit in that way. And I think we have sort of internalized the view, for example, that homeowners can claim tax credits for paying their mortgages. And in some places like Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., you can claim a credit for your rental costs when you rent your home. And I think that's great. I think it helps people pay for their costs. But maybe these governments should also be thinking about transportation as something that actually everyone deserves some access to and some assistance for. And so maybe that can be part of the free fare equation.
Yeah, some sort of a tax credit, something along those
Something
lines.
like that, yeah.
It's interesting. We posted a plenary from Railvolution, and Peter Rogoff was on, and he kind of pushed back on free transit because a lot of employers in the Seattle area pay big bucks for passes for their whole workforce. And I thought that was interesting too, just from a where you get your money standpoint, because they obviously make a lot of money off the Amazons of the world because of that. But, if we structured our tax system correctly, I think that you wouldn't have to have that argument about, whether you're actually going to give that, it's his argument is like you're benefiting them by making them pay less for transportation. Whereas, in my mind, you should just be taxing them appropriately anyways and pull as much out of them as you can. There's a fight here in San Francisco about delivery services and, using the zoning code to kind of clamp down on Amazon and the last mile delivery centers. And it's interesting to see how much of that is like a proxy war for all these other things like transportation, because of all the vehicles that are coming out of that area. It's a proxy war for wage arguments, whether people should be paid more than minimum wage or more than, the prevailing wage in a certain area. But they're using zoning as the target because that's what they have control over. So, we could have a congestion pricing, or we can have actual wages, or we can have the zoning that picks apart this thing. And so it's this proxy war that land use is being used as, which is really fascinating as well, which kind of goes back to that Rogoff thing, is like, there's all other ways to do this, but you're using this way to do it instead. Fascinating.
Should I give another prediction?
Yeah, you got one more, unless you have more. But
well, I have a multi-part New York region prediction.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I like to hear that.
So the prediction is about 4 separate things.
Are they interconnected?
They're all related to local projects and the federal government. So I think number 1, I think that the Gateway project will receive in 2022 or before our next show a commitment from the federal government for one of its mega infrastructure grants. So these are some of the new large infrastructure project funds coming from the infrastructure law. And I think that the Gateway project will get that this year to be able to fund that project. Number 1.
Okay.
Number 2, I think that the second phase of the Second Avenue subway going up to 125th Street will get its New Starts grant agreement. I think it's going to happen this year. Number 3, I think that the Interborough Express project, which is, connecting Brooklyn and Queens,
the one that the Governor Hochul
just announced a few months ago. Okay. I think it's going to be serious, and I think they're going to move forward into the federal process. They're going to put it into the federal planning process by the end of the year. And number 4, I think that the LaGuardia Air Train is going to be definitively canceled and replaced with a new subway extension plan to the airport from Astoria. I think that the governor is going to do that. So number 4 is the most dangerous because I don't know if anybody's serious about this subway extension, but I'm just going to throw it out there. I think it's going to be announced by the end of the year.
Now, is this a sports parlay where you have to get them all right to win?
Yeah.
Or is this an individual? Because, you know how a parlay works, right? Basically, you bet on 4 different games and they all have to go right for you to win. But it's a bigger payout.
It's going to be a big win, because I'm going to win all of them. So I'm going to get a huge payout.
Okay, all right. I'll hold you to that. I like those. Those are good. It's interesting. Whatever happened to de Blasio's streetcar line? Is that just kind of slowly disappear?
It's still in my database because no one has officially killed it, but I think it's dead.
Seems dead. Yeah. I didn't want to add that onto your thing, but I'm wondering if some of that energy is going to go towards the Interborough Express. It feels like that's...
I absolutely think so, especially since the skepticism of the BQX, I believe is the official term for the streetcar, was all about it being a giveaway to developers, about, just reinforcing gentrifying areas. Whereas the justification for the Interborough Express is very different. It's about, frankly, connecting a lot of working class communities, helping people get between subway lines sort of on the far end of the system. It's a very different vision for what the role of transit is supposed to be. And there's been much less active criticism and much more positive feelings about that project. So I'm optimistic about it.
Now, there's also the BQE discussion, which is the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, and whether that should be torn down or tunneled or whatever it is that the discussion of the day is about it. Have you seen anything about that? I haven't seen anything about that lately either.
I've not seen an announcement from the mayor's office. I think for better or worse, it is a highway that is very well used by a lot of drivers. And I am very skeptical of a mayor being willing to tear that kind of facility down. So I'm more on the side of believing that he will likely announce a reconstruction than tearing it down.
Okay. All right. But they have to do something with it, right?
I think the viaduct is in bad shape.
Yeah. Well, roads and bridges. All right. Well, Yonah, where can folks find you online if they want to find any of your work?
So I'm doing most of my work at the Urban Institute, so urban.org. But you can also see some of my other work at thetransportpolitic.com.
Awesome. And you can follow you on Twitter at Freemark. Is that right? Correct? Awesome. Although maybe you don't want people to follow you.
Oh, no. I always want more followers. So I want to be an influencer.
Okay.
Influence the world.
I thought you already were an influencer. That's why. That's what I thought. But maybe not. Who knows what people want to do these days? It's a crazy world out there. Well, Yonah, thanks so much, as always, for joining us 10 years, or actually 10 episodes. I shouldn't say 10 years, because I think we started in 2013 or so, 2014. So it's been 4, 6, 7, 8 years. 8 years of podcasting. So we appreciate you coming on each time.
It's great. Always happy.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.